Not too long ago, I was in a big group chat, and for fun, I asked a question and it caused a big argument. I asked, if everyone in this group chat had to live with the people who were in the same Hogwarts house as them, how would they decorate their shared living space, and would they get along? I basically wanted to have a conversation about how so-and-so snores, who will be bad as roommates even though they're good friends now, and to find out people's aesthetic senses. And I did find that out. Weirdly, all the people who saw themselves as Hufflepuff were all super into trains. That was really fun to find out. Our Hufflepuff dorm would be full of trains. Thank God I'm not one of them, I laughed. The people who identified as Slytherins are all the type to keep each other up until 4 a.m. arguing about philosophy and life and politics, and everyone who would stop them wouldn't be in that house, so that would be fun, but awful for their sleep schedules. Haha, such fun. But this accidentally caused a real argument in which some people thought it was basically immoral to align yourself with characters that are meant to be allegorical Nazis, and they didn't want to talk about interior design now that people in the group chat had done that. So instead, we had a massive argument about, among other things, fiction, queerbaiting, schools' institutional neglect of vulnerable teenagers, our own traumas, Snape's history, Snape's particular moral position, and fascism. Anyway, I blame all this on Draco Malfoy and the history of the Harry Potter fandom. Clickety-clackety-clack, I'm gonna put a little bit of lip balm on. Part 1. Canon. Stories with plots spanning 2 generations often like to set up mistakes in the first generation which characters attempt to correct or deal with in the next generation. So many stories are like this on a huge scale. This is Hamlet and Romeo and Juliet. Harry Potter as a series has a really tight version of this setup by book 3. Harry learns the story of his parents' generation, and from that point on, this story from one generation back hovers over Harry's story. James, a good pureblood boy, Sirius, a traitor to his family, Remus, a werewolf, and Peter, who was also there. They were all friends. Sirius betrays Remus during their school days, but is forgiven. They go to war. Peter betrays them. Sirius is blamed. Peter has faked his death. Sirius is in prison. James is dead, and Remus is left alone to grieve. This is an awful story, and because it's one generation back and all of the context surrounding it is reappearing, it is the place to look to figure out mistakes, what not to do, etc., etc. It possibly holds lessons for society at large. Sirius was sentenced by Bartimus Crouch Sr., who, in the First Wizarding War, would just send people to prison without a trial, which is bad. But this story is also very personal, and it seems kind of obvious, especially as Harry is searching his father's character for information about himself, to assume we as readers can draw personal comparisons too. So, if the 4 Marauders are lines we can draw to the main characters for Harry Potter, which is which? Well, Remus is Hermione. They have superficial character traits like being tied to academia more strongly than their peers, Hermione by everything and Remus by being introduced as a teacher, but essentially they have something that makes broader society hate them. It's innate to them and can't be removed. Their friends don't have this thing. They not only have to deal with the oppression, but also the insecurity that comes from all their closest friends not having experienced that oppression. And Ron is Peter, deeply insecure that he's not as good as his peers, desperate to be marked as special in a way that they're not, and vulnerable to narratives in which his friends aren't as good as they say they are, and aren't really his friends. Ron does abandon his friends because of this flaw in Goblet of Fire. It's just not as big a betrayal as Peter's, and he is sorry and is able to return. And then there's Harry. Who do we line up Harry to? On the one hand, there's his own father, who he aligns himself with via his Patronus, who, like Harry, never backed down from fighting Voldemort. A brave Gryffindor willing to die for love. Okay, that works. But James has parts of him that Harry is appalled by. He's an awful bully to a boy in another house who doesn't necessarily do a lot to antagonize him, though he did fight back. He is also a weird arse to the object of his affection, who clearly wants nothing to do with him, and he doesn't stop harassing her. Okay, maybe this isn't Harry. Maybe it's someone else. Maybe Harry is Sirius, who hates the people who raised him, only experienced real love at Hogwarts, who believes fully you should be willing to die for your friends. In Prisoner of Azkaban, Peter explains Voldemort would have killed him, and Sirius screams back, "Then you should have died. Died rather than betray your friends, as we would have done for you." Sirius was believed for years to be a traitor. Similarly, Harry goes through phases where the whole wizarding world hates him because of fake news. This also kind of works. But again, there are bits that don't fully match. Sirius has a family who do kind of want him, who would accept him if he accepted them. Sirius is also kind of ruthless. He goes after his enemies at the expense of his friends, where allies dying for the greater good is a lesson Harry refuses to learn from Dumbledore. Maybe this isn't Harry either. And I guess if you're keeping score, you've spotted the same problem in this schema that I have. 4 isn't 3. There aren't enough characters in Harry's generation to make this comparison work. One theory that floated around was that Neville would be the 4th, and people drew comparisons to Peter. This would make Harry and Ron equals James and Sirius, 2 best friends. This, I think, is less steadfast than Ron as an improvement on Peter. So, what is the other option? The character that can pick up the themes from the Marauder generation that Harry doesn't reflect, and neither do Ron or Hermione. The loose themes we want to mark are a character that can't stop harassing students who don't want to be harassed, out of both hatred and affection, who goes too far too fast without considering empathy until it's a bit late, who maybe deals with the same issues Sirius did, being offered love, affection and wealth, but only on specific conditions of believing something bad. I mean, you've seen the title, you know I'm talking about Draco. For this tight, near one-to-one correspondence to the previous generation, in which the new generation improves on the previous one, you would have to involve Draco more heavily. Our Peter analogy, Ron is able to admit he was wrong and come back. More importantly, from book 1, Ron is shown as fully willing to sacrifice himself for his friends. Sirius would never have needed to shout at him, "You should have died to your friends aged 33. He knew at age 11. Hermione is not tested in exactly the same way Remus is, but where Remus accepted Sirius's so-called betrayal, Hermione shows over and over again that she's really willing to go sleuthing by herself and find the real truth. She does it with Flamel, the Basilisk, Rita Skeeter. Try and imagine not knowing what happens in book 7. Maybe not even book 6. You just have the setup and your knowledge of how stories work. This story is kind of saying, this generation can improve upon the previous one. The previous generation weren't able to fully stamp out evil and hatred, but this one will. From this critical perspective, it would be a bizarre move for the other setups to not be fulfilled. Bizarre that the second generation would be worse at recruiting from the dark side than the first one was. Bizarre for a story in which the wise old sage tells us over and over our weapon is love to not be interested in converting more people over to their side with love. Bizarre that, having seen a story in which people are fundamentally unable to reconcile, talk about their issues, find some kind of forgiveness, and then half of them just die, the narrative wouldn't be interested in changing that. My point here isn't Draco deserved to be redeemed. I'm not saying a story where racists raise a racist son and he's always kind of racist isn't true to life. I'm not even saying that story has nothing to teach us. In fact, a world where it used to be more possible for people to cross over from the dark side than it is now is also kind of interesting in light of, politics. For more on Draco's redemption and whether he actually deserved one, YouTuber Quinn Curio has a really in-depth video. But for the purposes of this video, all I'm saying is many readers who were invested in these books kind of just expected a redemption arc. Part 2. Fandom. The reason I wanted to make this video essay was because I watched Sarah Z's video on the fandom surrounding the character the Onceler from the 2012 movie The Lorax. It's a very interesting video and I recommend it. In it, she said that fans at this time, i.e. people who wanted to be fans of things, existed in a culture where saying you like a character can often be taken as condoning the character's actions. Therefore, fans who were interested in villains were only outwardly interested in what she called soft boy villains, characters who don't do much wrong on their own and are redeemable. And she points out this culture still exists today, and that's why you see people outwardly defending characters like Kylo Ren, who are intended to be read as fascists, and wanting them to be instead read as misunderstood or manipulated. And I watched this video, and when it got to this conclusion, I thought, that's the Drarry fandom's fault. I don't mean this in like a mean way, I mean a series of things happened to make this culture where you can only like things in certain ways, and I think Drarry and perhaps Dramonie, though I know less about that, is central to how it happened. As far as I know, the first Draco-Harry fanfiction was written after the second book came out, and Harry Potter fandom got big fast. Loads of the established tropes and fanon interpretations of characters happened before the series was over. Canon is what we are given in the main text. Fanon is a generally accepted fan view of a character, kind of an invisible canon, things treated kind of as facts which you know if you're in fandom, but which would be meaningless to people who aren't. For example, Blaise wasn't given a gender in the first book in which the character was mentioned. His name is just in a list of children to be sorted, Blaise Zabini, Slytherin. So, in a lot of fanfiction written before the series was over, Blaise is a woman. This is possibly a whole other video essay topic, but I am 99% sure this is why Blaise is so often gay in fanfiction. The fact that fandom wasn't sure of Blaise's gender identity meant that the fanon version of the character fit certain roles and was available for certain pairings, and those fanon ideas were beloved. So, when Blaise was word of godded into a man, that man was seen as gay. I don't think there's any canon text to support this, but it's really common because fanon was built on incomplete information, and fandom and its influence was huge. I'm also not saying gender identity and sexuality map onto each other in this way in real life, but for people who primarily get interested in writing characters' romantic histories that align with status sexualities, this finagling of Blaise kind of makes sense if you squint. In most fandoms, you can spend more time reading fanfiction than absorbing the main text, but nowhere is this really more true than Harry Potter, and this has almost always been the case, even when Deathly Hallows hadn't come out. Before the series was over, around the time of the 6th book, you can already see tropes in Drarry that are being parodied or having their tropes restyled. People are adding new twists to what are already considered old classics like resorting fics, Draco is a Vila fics. Tropes that can only exist in this fandom are old hat. And Draco was being built into a fandom version of himself. Much is often made of Cassandra Clare's Draco and leather pants effect, which happened in this time frame in which Draco was transformed into an object of desire, but you also had the influence of writers like Maya, who had her fanfiction wrecked in, wait for it, Time magazine. Maya really pushed into the fanon version of Draco that he loves plots and plans, that he's charismatic and funny, that he's hugely melodramatic, he's book smart, and addicted to coffee, all of which you can see the inheritance of in Drarry fanfiction published much, much later. I presume it's also visible in Draco Hermione fanfic too, as Maya wrote Dramonie, and in some sense there was a Draco fandom rather than a Drarry fandom, but I have only read Dramonie by Maya though, so I can't really speak to how that fandom developed. But I think one of the central things you can see in the fanon Draco from that period is that he is redeemed. Not redeemable, but taken as read, that he can be redeemed, will be redeemed. Book 7 isn't out yet, but by the time that story is over, whether or not it's a major plot point or a background one, Draco will pick up the inheritance of his mentor Snape and his cousin Sirius. He will turn his back on the dark. The power of love and the light will triumph. Draco will be redeemed. This isn't to say that fanfiction from that time was uninterested in how that redemption might happen, that they didn't show it. They did. Lots of Maya's fanfiction was interested in this, and lots of other fanfiction was interested in this, but it was considered a choice. You want to tell that story where Draco is redeemed? That's fine. I'm going to tell a story that ignores that aspect because I 100% trust J.K. Rowling will do that for me, and fanfiction is for what the author doesn't do. Which, once the 7th book came out, left the fandom with a problem. It had been taken as read that yes, Draco is bad, yes, he needs to be redeemed. The only thing visible in fandom, however, was the conclusion. We love Draco Malfoy. And that's a pretty bad banner to have on your blog when the powers that be are like, great, Draco Malfoy is a racist Nazi and that's all he ever was. When you assume, hey? And this led to a lot of the ideas floating around fandom that were raised in the argument that I began this video with. How can you stake any part of your affection, interest, time, and identity on anything associated with these people? especially when you've spent no time in building any justification for having done so for years on end. The central fanon Draco wasn't built out of, we know this guy's 100% awful, we're just doing something different, and all the justifications and thoughtfulness that would have implied. He was kind of just forgiven preemptively by fandom. And with the rise of neo-fascism that happened since the publication of the last book, through the release of the films, that question has become more and more pronounced in the Draco case. How can you ship a fascist with someone that their state would kill? Does that fantasy do something to you? Is that thing good? For me, the Draco question combines with other questions about political struggle that belong to this world. Can the left recruit from the proto-Nazi pool of people that's ever-growing? Can we convince them they're wrong? If we can, what is the status of their forgiveness? Do we have a coherent narrative for how this kind of thing happens? The canon text of Harry Potter seems to posit, no, you can't. It was possible before, but lines have been drawn and they can't be crossed. Those people might end up living in our societies once we have won, but we won't interact with them much, and they will be powerless to enact any bad ideas they have. They might independently leave those ideas behind, but that's their business. All that needs to happen is that they lose. But the fandom created a different space. That answer was basically unthinkable to them. They answered, yes, people can be converted and reintegrated and end up connected to their community, but it didn't have a clear vision of how, and it became a question that for me kind of haunts Drarry. On the one hand, you have fics that push the question away, that position Draco as disliked kind of only on personal grounds. And then there are fics that look at the full ramifications, but they find it really hard too. And where they fail to convince us they've successfully rehabilitated Draco, they've drawn even more attention to the fact that their story is about fascist loving. There's also a group of fics which imagine a world in which the light turn around and oppress, or at any rate abuse, the opposite faction of society. This does basically nothing to the central question, as it turns a real villain into a soft boy villain, one who is abused unfairly, and makes a kind of both sides case. I'm not saying anyone who writes something in any of these ways is bad, I'm just saying that that's the Drarry writer's burden, and it hovers over the readers too. It haunts almost every type of Drarry story except outright rewrites and alternate universes. And the whole fandom is pretty vulnerable to anyone pointing out that they're writing stories about a racist and someone ostensibly on the side of the oppressed falling in love. To avoid this, a storyteller either needs to convince us of a form of forgiveness that makes sense, that combines regret and atonement in a way we can understand, or risk saying, that other character on the side of the oppressed, yeah, he will stop caring about the oppressed when he gets horny. And that how to do forgiveness thing is the sort of thing religions are formed to solve. It's not easy. And I don't think Drarry is bad. In fact, I think that because its writers have to deal with stuff like this, they sometimes end up writing much more mature and interesting pieces of work, but that's a lot of complicated politics and philosophy for what started as your light-hearted spare time hobby where you read community-driven romance novels. So when looking for new fandoms in which to spend one's free time, it makes sense that the Draco side of the Harry Potter fandom acts as this warning shadow. You don't want to end up like that, vulnerable to being told you are bad for liking the bad man and spending huge mental energy on some of the most complex human issues so you can justify writing a kissing scene. Oh good, we solved the problem of how to deal with sin and the existence of evil. So you get the soft boy villain obsession that Sarah Z talks about, where it's easiest to like characters who are only kind of aesthetically villainous or haven't done much wrong, and alongside that you get defenses of Draco and characters like Kylo Ren that posit they didn't really do anything wrong, or if they did, they were abused and manipulated, so we don't really need to deal with those big questions. Interestingly, the other big place to find a villainous love is things like Hannibal, in which the character is evil, is killing and eating people, but there was never any ambiguity. Hannibal isn't going to repent. The show itself is a fanfiction of the Silence of the Lambs character who, we know, doesn't repent. There is no uncertainty. The story was over before it began. We can go in, eyes open, and say, I like this character. He is evil. But in this case, as well, you don't have to answer, what would it take to redeem this character? Because you aren't trying to. You aren't trying to get to a place where Hannibal hangs out with his victims' friends and they're chill knowing about what he's done. So you don't have anything like the Drarry problem. So the first thought I wanted to express with this video is made. I think I know why the soft boy villain became popular, and it's because Draco didn't get a redemption arc. Part 3. Baggage. And now, because I'm the one who brought it up, I'm left with all the same baggage as the Drarry fandom was left with. On the one hand, I don't think the question of how forgiveness and redemption works is really one fandom is best equipped to answer. Leave that up to the politicos, the philosophers, I think. On the other hand, I do deeply care about those questions, and one of the only ways humans are able to conceptualize the world is through stories, and stories about this are kind of sparse. I can watch endless video essays about our current political situation, the way a political argument is structured, how cults work, how belief works, how humans interact with each other and wield power over each other, but I find very few stories in legitimate fiction, or in fandom, that deal with how that impacts an individual. Philosophy and essays can describe to us how movements rise and fall, how people are recruited, and how they might leave, but they can't do as well on how those individuals should deal with their past, if they ever get to a place where they're trying to. Stories can give us little examples of that kind of thing, though. Like, to give you an example of what I'm trying to talk about, when I was a teen, I logically knew some factual things about abuse and domestic violence, but it was a fanfic of characters from a naughties sitcom that showed me scenes of it playing out to the point where I was able to think for the first time, oh, I understand. I understand why a person might stay in this situation, and what they might feel about it, and why it's hard to leave. And that really helped me see something I didn't understand before. So on the third hand, I do want some storyteller, whether it be a fanfic writer or a screenwriter or a novelist, to give me some narrative of how forgiveness and redemption works. And on the fourth hand, I wonder if this is possible at all for fiction. Shakespeare wrote this play once called The Winter's Tale. I've performed monologues from this play before. I've studied it at uni. It's not regarded as one of the better Shakespeare plays. It just has some good bits. It's the source of exit pursued by a bear. If you read the synopsis on Wikipedia, it probably won't make any sense, so I will tell you the story according to how it was taught to me once in a lecture that stayed with me ever since. King Leontes has a wife, Hermione. She tries to be nice to people. He becomes convinced she's cucked him. He has the power as a king, so despite her protestations, he puts her in prison, where she gives birth to a child Leontes refuses to believe is his. An oracle makes clear he is wrong. He ignores the oracle. Leontes orders the newborn to be abandoned in the wilderness. News arrives that without her, Hermione's older child has died. Hermione dies in prison. Leontes realizes he was wrong, but he's already lost his wife and children. He promises to spend the rest of his days atoning. 16 years pass and Leontes is still in mourning and atonement. Unbeknownst to him, his second child survived. She arrives in his kingdom and they are reunited and happy. Leontes begs for forgiveness from the man he previously accused of cuckolding him. The characters all come across a statue of Hermione. Leontes is distraught still at seeing an image of her because he is still full of grief and regret and love. Then a miracle happens. The statue comes to life, and Hermione is restored. The end. What do we do with this? There are, like, 3 of the plots to this play. His child has a fiancé and some other stuff goes on, but this is it. And, like, how do you stage that final scene? Presumably you have to have the actress playing Hermione on stage standing very still, but still obviously a human, not a prop, and then all the characters have to be like, oh, what a nice statue. Oh, it's magically coming to life! How shocking! Anyway, the lecturer who made me like this story had this to say. The Winter's Tale straight up goes, how do we forgive people who do heinous things? And the answer is magic. It crucially doesn't say people cannot be forgiven, but it cannot articulate what it takes to forgive beyond it is a miracle that anyone can forgive in the first place. Sometimes we wake up and we've forgiven people who hurt us, and we can't even explain why. It's a miracle for both parties. Maybe it's for the best, because if there were steps to take, there would almost definitely be a way to manipulate people into forgiveness, so... Anyway, that's the best story I know about forgiveness. I would love to hear a story that's better. Maybe one that looks at how we live in the world after that. One that asks what we do with people who have done heinous things to people who aren't us, so it isn't up to us to forgive them. Or one that asks, what if some people who were hurt have forgiven, but not all of them? And that's where I run out of thoughts on this subject, because I'm still not done thinking. What do you think?